Hey everyone, I'm Belle Reid, and thanks for tuning in. So I get a lot of questions from people who are just getting started with modular synthesis and are curious about how to jump into Eurorack or how to expand their synth setups. Maybe they're coming over from a semi-modular system and they're curious about starting their first Eurorack system, or they already have a small Eurorack setup and they're looking to expand, maybe get a second case or a bigger case or something like that. And I obviously love modular synths and Eurorack. I mean, take a look around me here, but there are also a lot of really interesting ways to expand your musical setup that don't necessarily involve diving into Eurorack or buying a second case. So today I want to share some ideas with you about combining synthesizers with effects pedals. I'm going to talk about why this might be something that is a good fit for you, how it all works in terms of connecting your semi-modular or your modular gear with guitar pedals. I'm going to talk about what kinds of effects work particularly well with modular, and also how expression pedals and control voltage fit into all of this. So you might be wondering why you would want to combine modular gear with effects pedals. And you might also be wondering, wouldn't it be better to just keep everything the same format? When I first started out making electronic music, I had, and I guess I actually still have, a pretty hodgepodge approach to everything. My very first setup was a single Eurorack module, and I would also use a Mackie audio mixer that I would do a bunch of feedback with. Sometimes I would use my computer in the mix. Other times I would throw in some other random piece of gear, and it was great. But over the last few years, I've been doing a lot of teaching, and I've helped a lot of folks get started with modular synthesis. And I've noticed that people tend to assume if they want to make music with modular synthesizers, that they have to do everything with a modular synthesizer. And so if they want to add a new voice or a new effect into their musical setup, they automatically kind of assume that if they started with Eurorack, they need to continue with Eurorack. So they'll assume that the best way forward is for them to just buy another module and then another module, maybe rearrange things. Once their case gets full, now they buy a new case and then some more modules, and now they have all this extra space to fill up in that case, and things just kind of start to spiral out of control from there. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. I clearly have a Eurorack module or 50 myself, but if you're at a point where you're just branching out from a semi-modular system, or you have a small case and you want to expand, but you don't necessarily want to go get an entirely new Eurorack case, working with effects pedals might end up being a much simpler and ultimately more affordable solution. And for those of you who are already invested in the Eurorack world, it's interesting, if nothing else, to think of guitar effects pedals as simply adding a ton of new variety and options to your potential musical setup. It used to be the case that guitar effects pedals were simply rehashing the same few ideas that have been going on since the 70s. But now there are a lot of really creative companies like Red Panda, Maris, Chase Bliss, Earthquaker Devices, and plenty of others that are doing super cool, idiosyncratic, and complex things that are every bit as nuanced or complex as Eurorack. All that said, there are some technical things to consider when combining your modular gear with effects pedals, so let's dive into some of that now. All right, so the first thing you'll want to consider when you're connecting your semi-modular or modular gear with effects pedals is optimizing the signal level between everything. Different types of gear are going to produce different voltage levels, and they're going to expect different voltage levels at their inputs and outputs. So when you're connecting different formats of gear together, it's important to consider this in order to be able to match everything so that you can get the best results. Generally, in the world of music-related gear, signal levels fall into 4 different categories. Those 4 categories are mic level, instrument level, line level, and modular level. All right, so our first signal level range is mic level. Microphones are electromagnetic devices that produce fluctuating current due to the physical movement of magnetic materials relative to one another. Now, because of the way they work, they produce very small fluctuations in voltage. This is why microphone preamps exist and why they're built into basically every audio interface and mixer out there, so that you can actually boost the level of the microphone enough for it to be usable alongside other instruments and devices. Our next signal level category is instrument level. Instrument level signals have a higher voltage range than microphones. This is the signal level produced by things like guitars, basses, and other instruments with passive pickups. The next signal level category is line level, which, depending on the piece of gear, can vary a good bit in terms of output voltage range. Many pieces of professional audio gear produce output voltages around 2 volts peak to peak. This is the signal level range typically produced by keyboard synths, drum machines, mixers, audio interfaces, and so on. And then, coming in hot, sorry, very bad pun, is modular level. Eurorack signal levels are commonly 10 volts peak to peak. And this can be where we run into a little bit of trouble. Because modular synthesizers tend to produce such high output levels, interfacing them with other devices such as audio interfaces, mixers, and pedals can be a little bit of a challenge. Most effects pedals, for instance, are designed to accept signals from instrument level devices like guitars, or also from line level devices. Oh, and a quick note, if you're using a semi-modular synth, there's a good chance that your instrument has a line level output. For example, the Ocoast and the Strega, you can use the headphone output as a line level output. And the outputs that are on the back of the Mother 32 and the DFAM and the Subharmonicon are all line level outputs. So in this case, it means that you can interface directly from your semi-modulars to effects pedals with no problem at all. On the other hand, if we want to run an audio signal from our Eurorack into an effects pedal, the best practice is to attenuate or reduce that signal level before we run it into our effects pedal. And there's a couple ways that we can do this. First off, there are some dedicated modules that are designed to help you interface your Eurorack system with effects pedals. Many of these are designed to allow you to insert an effects pedal in your Eurorack signal chain. So often they'll contain both an output attenuation section to get your synth into the pedal and a preamp so that you can get the signal out of the pedal and back into your modular system. This is great for situations where you want to apply effects to a single voice in your system and then mix things together further down the line, for example. Now, depending on your situation, using a dedicated module like this might actually be overkill. If you're really just trying to add some end-of-chain processing, like a reverb or delay, a simple Eurorack output module might be sufficient. Now, if you don't have an output module in your system, your final option is to use an attenuator or a VCA to scale the signals that are coming out of your synth. So whatever sound you want to process by your pedals, you would first need to run that into a VCA or use an attenuator to turn it down. This method works fine on a technical level, but it can be kind of fiddly to dial it in. Because VCAs are usually at unity gain when they're fully turned up, it means that you're going to have to turn down the knob quite a lot in order to get it to be at an ideal level for the pedal. So it can be tough to hone in on the right amount of attenuation with this method. Whereas if you're using a dedicated insert or output module, it will instantly put you in the right ballpark. Okay, so all of these are equally valid ways of getting your audio from your modular synth into your effects pedals. And hopefully you're starting to see which approach is the best for your purposes. So now that we've handled this technical issue, let's move on to another big question, which is, am I going to damage anything? Thankfully, the short answer is no. You're probably not going to damage anything. As long as you're attenuating your signals that are coming out of your modular synth, the pedal won't really care about much else from that point forward. A signal is a signal, and as long as the levels are at an optimal level for the pedal, you shouldn't damage anything. Now, if you don't attenuate signals, then you're in slightly dicier territory. Realistically, in many situations, nothing very bad is going to happen. You may encounter problems that range from your sound clipping and distorting simply because it's too hot for what the pedal is expecting, but you also may encounter some problems that are a little more severe. So I would recommend just erring on the side of caution here and always making sure that you are attenuating your signals before they hit your pedals. Okay, so now that we have gone over these technical considerations, let's think about some musical considerations. So just like the world of Eurorack, there are a ton of different options out there when it comes to effects pedals. But certain types of effects pedals tend to lend themselves to slightly more interesting musical results when paired with modular synths. Now, I tend to think of effects as falling generally into 4 different categories. We have time-based effects, pitch-based effects, effects that alter a sound's spectral profile, and amplitude-based effects. Now, these are just loose categories based on how I like to think about things. I'm sure there are lots of other categories and ways to kind of group pedals. And you'll find that there's certainly some overlap between these categories as well, but it's still helpful to break them down, and you'll understand why I'm thinking about it this way as we move forward. So time domain effects are things like reverb, delay, flanger, chorus, granular processing, and so on. And these tend to work really well on modular. There are a lot of really cool things out there that rival similar types of effects that we have in modular format. Then there are effects that alter the pitch content of a signal. So I tend to think of things that fall in this category like pitch shifters, frequency shifters, and ring modulators. And generally speaking, these types of effects work really well with modular synthesizers as well. Now, this is an area in particular where there's a lot of really interesting development happening in pedal format specifically. Now, one catch here is that pitch shift pedals are designed to receive a relatively pure and stable input sound. So things can get kind of weird when you send in noisier or less pure sound material. Now, weird is not necessarily always a bad thing, but depending on the pedal you're using, you may end up hearing a lot more digital artifacts and kind of just strange extra sound when you're sending in noisier material. Another thing to consider is that pitch shift pedals will handle polyphony in different ways. Some will be able to handle chords and pitch shift chords, whereas others will start to glitch like crazy when they receive more than one sound at once. Again, this is not necessarily a bad thing. It can actually sound pretty interesting, but it's just something to keep in mind. So the third effect category are pedals that alter the spectral profile of a sound. So these are things like filters, EQs, and wahs. Naturally, filters are a big part of working with synthesizers, but it's important to note that filters that are designed for guitars and basses may not have the same kind of frequency response that you're used to having access to in a filter that was designed for a modular system. That being said, there are a lot of filter and EQ and wah pedals that do provide a very usable and wonderful range of frequencies. For example, the WMD Protostar and Dr. Scientist Dusk, to name just a couple. But again, this is just something to be aware of because it does vary from pedal to pedal. The last category of effects are dynamically responsive effects. So things like fuzz, overdrive, and distortion are designed to sound really good with guitars and basses. But if you just play a typical synthesizer patch into this kind of effect pedal, you'll find that you don't get the same kind of timbral depth that you would get if you were playing a guitar. The reason behind this has to do with a fundamental difference in thought between how sound sculpting happens on a synthesizer versus how sound sculpting is thought of in effects processing on guitars. So let's take a second to unpack this a little further. So most forms of synthesis are kind of like sculpture. You start with a big, constant block of sound, which might be the output of an oscillator or a noise source, and then you gradually carve away at it in order to get to your final result. We can process this block of sound through filters to remove frequency content, or through amplifiers to give it dynamic variation. But the default behavior of the synthesizer is just to drone on at a constant volume forever. In order to create a sense of dynamic range and motion and articulation, you need to very intentionally factor that into your patch. This is the case with modular synthesizers and keyboard synths. Unless you're being very intentional about how you're using your playing velocity on a keyboard, your output sound is going to be more or less constant. And unless you're particularly clever, the dynamic profile of every single one of your notes is going to be identical based on how you have your envelope set. That's very characteristic of the way that we tend to think of a synthesizer sounding. Now, on the other side of things, the world of guitar processing is completely different from this. Instead of a big, unwavering block of sound, guitar processing assumes that at the beginning of the signal chain, there is a dynamic, constantly fluctuating signal. Each individual sound going into your effects chain is going to have its own unique dynamic profile, and every individual note is going to have a slightly different articulation and loudness than the note before it and the note after it. Guitar processing hinges on the fact that its source material already has a lot of dynamic and timbral fluctuations, simply due to the mechanical realities of strings and fingers and frets and picks and so on, all interacting in unpredictable ways. So guitar effects like fuzz, distortion, and overdrive all react to the way that the player plays. The louder they play, the more intense the effect will be, and as the sound dies off, the quality of the effect changes. But of course, that doesn't mean that these kinds of pedals are useless in the context of modular synthesizers. It just means that we need to be a little bit more intentional about the kinds of patches that we are pairing with these kinds of effects. So if we are a little bit more intentional about creating patches that have more dynamic variation and maybe modulate the envelopes and play with timbral modulation, then we're going to have a lot more success with these types of effects pedals. Okay, so we just talked about a whole lot, but to summarize in brief, all of these different types of effects can work just fine with modular synths. You may just want to adjust the way that you are playing and patching in order to get the best results out of them. The last big concept that I want to talk about has to do with modulation. So you might be thinking to yourself, okay, this guitar pedal stuff sounds fun, but one of the most important aspects of modular synthesis is modulation and control voltage. Well, you may not realize that many guitar pedals actually do have control voltage inputs. They're just not labeled control voltage. So expression pedal inputs on guitar pedals are traditionally intended to be used with pedals, expression pedals like this one, which give the player the ability to control some aspect of their sound while keeping their hands free to play their instrument. So depending on the design of any particular pedal, an expression pedal input may do a number of different things. Sometimes they are fixed to a specific parameter within the pedal. Other times they can be assigned to any number of different parameters. And in certain pedals, like the ones made by Red Panda or Maris, the expression pedal input can work as a kind of macro control to control multiple parameters of the sound at once. So in other words, these expression pedal inputs are control voltage inputs. But before you go and start plugging any old control voltage into your pedals, we need to talk about how an expression pedal works. So you might assume that an expression pedal is a source of modulation itself, kind of like a big knob that produces more or less voltage depending on how it's positioned. But that's not exactly correct. An expression pedal is an attenuator. Now, that might seem weird because an expression pedal connects to a pedal with just a single cable, whereas an attenuator and a synthesizer has an input and an output connection. So this is achieved by using a TRS cable for the expression pedal connection. Instrument cables or Eurorack patch cables are usually TS cables. A TS cable has a tip and a sleeve connection. Usually, the tip carries a signal and the sleeve is used as a ground connection between two devices. Now, TRS cables, on the other hand, have an extra conductor. So they have a tip, a ring, and a sleeve. The sleeve is still, in most situations, used as a ground connection, but the tip and the ring can carry any sort of signal you like. So in stereo audio cables, like the aux cable that you use with your phone, the tip and ring carry the left and right channels of audio, respectively. But the tip and ring could carry any signals, and those signals don't necessarily need to be going in the same direction as one another. And in the case of an expression pedal, the TRS cable is more like a two-lane highway. Inside your effects pedal, the jack's ring is connected to an internal reference voltage. For most effects pedals, this is a constant 5 or 3 volt signal. This voltage then travels over to the expression pedal, where it's connected to an internal potentiometer, which works exactly the same way that most knobs work. The output of this attenuation is then connected to the TRS cable's tip. And by varying the amount of attenuation on this constant voltage offset, you're able to create a voltage that varies in amplitude based on the position of the pedal. And this is then returned to the effects pedal. So because all that's inside of an expression pedal is a potentiometer, you can actually use any kind of variable resistor to create an expression pedal, like a light-dependent resistor or a force-sensitive resistor. And of course, I had to go ahead and give this a try. So if you're a super nerd like I am, then you can have fun trying this out on your own. Okay, we just talked about a whole lot, and you're probably wondering where I'm going with all of this. I do have a point, I promise. So basically, expression pedal jacks on effects pedals are essentially control voltage inputs. But there are some precautions to note here. Usually, expression pedal inputs expect a fairly low range, typically from 0 to 3 or 0 to 5 volts. But your modular system may output voltages that go beyond that range. So in this case, it's important to attenuate and or offset the voltages coming out of your modular synth in order to fit with what the pedal is expecting. The catch here is that not every pedal manufacturer is going to specify what their preferred voltage range is. So if the manual for your pedal doesn't specify this, you can easily find out what the voltage range is using a multimeter. So all you have to do is connect a TRS cable to your pedal's expression pedal jack, and then measure the differential voltage between the cable's sleeve and ring. The readout that you see on the multimeter will be the maximum voltage level that the pedal wants to accept. Now, I have never personally blown something up by sending control voltage from my synth into a pedal, but it is important to exercise caution here, and I recommend scaling your output voltages from your synth before you patch them into your pedals. One more thing to consider here is I recommend using a floating ring type cable to make this connection. So on this type of cable, the ring on the TRS end of the cable is unconnected on the TS end of the cable. This is important because it prevents unwanted connections between the pedal's reference voltage and your modular system's ground. Companies like Expert Sleepers produce these cables, and I'll leave a link down below where you can purchase them. Okay, so that's a lot of words to say that with some simple precautions, you can start to look at your guitar effects pedals as though they do have control voltage inputs. And with that, you're able to open up a whole new world of sonic possibilities. So we covered a lot of ground in this video. We talked about the different things you need to know in order to safely connect audio from your modular synths into your guitar effects pedals. We talked about different types of effects and how you may want to adapt your playing technique in order to get the best results out of them. And of course, we talked about how expression pedals work and how you can use expression pedal inputs to send control voltage from your modular synths to your pedals in order to modulate different parameters of sound. These rules generally will apply to most pedals, but every pedal is designed a little bit differently, and depending on specifically how the expression pedal input is designed for a given pedal, things may work a little bit differently. What I hope by now is that you realize that guitar pedals are not really that different from Eurorack modules. And with just a little bit of care, they can be used interchangeably. For me, this opens up a huge new range of musical possibilities, which is really exciting. So to that end, if you are brand new to this and you're just getting started with modular synthesis, or you've been experimenting with Eurorack for a while and you're just looking for new ways to expand into new territory, there's a lot of potential here for you to explore. Whenever you start to use something in a way that's not exactly intended, you tend to stumble across things that are pretty unusual and unexpected, which is something that I find really inspiring, and I hope you find it as inspiring as I do. I've included some affiliate links to a few of my favorite pedals in the description below this video. Anything you buy using those links helps to support my channel and makes it possible for me to continue making weird music and tutorials like this one. Also, if you're interested in getting started with modular synthesis, I'll leave a link to a free class called Your First Modular Synth Patch that teaches you the basics of modular signal flow and patching so that you can create your first modular patch from scratch. And you can do the whole class with nothing but your computer using the free Eurorack emulation software, VCVRack. Or if you're already comfy with the basics, but you're looking to dive a little deeper into compositional techniques with modular synthesizers and more advanced patching strategies and performance workflows, my 3-month online course and coaching program, Learning Sound and Synthesis, opens 2 times per year. So I'll leave a link to that as well in the description so you can check it out. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching and listening. I'll see you next time.